Alfred the Great. In the late 9th century, England is not yet England, more like a patchwork of anxious kingdoms trying to stay upright in a storm. Alfred of Wessex becomes king in 871, and for years his life is less about ceremony and more about survival. Contemporary accounts describe him moving through a landscape of burned villages and sudden raids with the constant dread that the next winter might end everything. The headline is simple: Vikings. But the reality is more complicated. Politics, shifting alliances, and the brutal arithmetic of food stores and manpower. Alfred's decisive moment is often tied to 878, when he rebounds after early setbacks and pushes back at Edington, then negotiates a settlement that draws a line across England. It isn't peace in the modern sense, it's a breathing space. What makes Alfred feel royal, even at a distance, is the way he turns survival into structure. Laws are gathered and shaped. Fortified towns, burhs, become anchors. Learning is promoted as if books might be another kind of wall. His court is still rough-edged, but the idea is forming. A king should be more than a war leader. He should be a builder of a realm. Edward the Elder. Edward, Alfred's son, inherits a kingdom that is sturdier but still surrounded by danger. In the early 10th century, power is not a stable chair, it's a moving horse. Edward's reign, beginning in 899, is defined by steady pressure, expanding control, consolidating fortified towns and tightening a net around territories long contested. He works closely with his formidable sister, Ethelflaed of Mercia, and together they push against the Danelaw in a coordinated campaign that feels almost modern in its method. It's not one glorious battle that changes everything, but a sequence. Fortify, supply, advance, secure, repeat. Official records indicate a deliberate pattern of building and holding, like someone turning scattered stones into a wall. Edward can be harder to romanticize than Alfred, because he doesn't fit the neat myth of a heroic turnaround. He feels like administration in armor, but in a sense, that is the point. The crown is becoming less like a personal trophy and more like an institution, one that expects continuity. In the quiet background of his reign, a larger story is happening. England is becoming imaginable as a single political space, even if it is still fragile and frequently argued over. Aethelstan, crowned in 925, is often described as the first king who can credibly be called King of the English, in something like a unified sense. His court carries a different atmosphere, more diplomatic, more literate, more aware of itself as a power among powers. Charters and formal documents expand, as if the kingdom is learning how to speak in ink. His reign is stitched together with alliances and pressure. He draws in regions that had their own identities and expectations, and he does so with a mix of force and negotiation. The defining military moment is usually tied to 937 at Brunanburh, a battle remembered in poetry as a great clash against a coalition of opponents. The exact location is disputed, but the consequence is clearer. Ethelstan's authority holds. What's striking is how his kingship feels outward-facing. Marriage connections and religious gifts link his court to the wider European world. The crown is no longer simply a local survival project. It's an entity that expects to be recognized. In a lull of candlelight and parchment, you can almost hear the sound of government forming, slowly, imperfectly, like a language learning its grammar. Edmund's reign begins in 939, and it has the uneasy feeling of a house settling after an earthquake. Walls still standing, but cracks appearing where you didn't notice them before. He inherits a kingdom that has been pulled together, yet still strains at the seam. Rival claimants and regional loyalties remain dangerously alive. He spends much of his reign reasserting control over the north, where power has long been contested by Scandinavian rulers and local magnates. There is a persistent rhythm of taking, losing, and retaking, territory as a tide rather than a line. It's a reminder that unified England is not a finished product. It is a daily negotiation. Edmund dies young in 946, killed in a violent incident that later storytelling turns into something almost cinematic, an altercation, a sudden blade. However it happened in detail, the effect is the same. The crown passes quickly again, and continuity depends on the system holding. If Alfred is the builder and Ethelstan the consolidator, Edmund feels like a caretaker in a storm, keeping the roof from lifting while the next generation tries to grow into the weight of what has been made. Edred takes the throne in 946, and the mood remains tense. Northern England is still unstable, with York and its surrounding region often acting like a restless hinge between worlds. Edred's reign becomes a test of royal stamina. Can the crown enforce obedience without collapsing into constant civil conflict? He leans on powerful churchmen and administrators, and the role of the royal council becomes more visible. It is a subtle shift. The crown's strength increasingly relies on networks rather than just personal charisma. Contemporary accounts emphasize both resistance and punishment, suggesting a hard edge to his authority. Edred's health is described as poor, and the image of a king ruling while physically weakened adds to the sense of fragility. Yet the kingdom does not fall apart. That matters. Sometimes the most important achievement is simply that the structure survives an unimpressive reign. When Eadred dies in 955, the crown has not become safe, but it has become stubborn. It clings on. It endures. And that endurance, quiet, administrative, sometimes brutal, becomes one of the crown's most defining traits over the long centuries ahead. Eadwig. Eadwig becomes king in 955, and almost immediately the reign is wrapped in scandal, faction, and bitter political storytelling. He is young, and the court feels like it has split into rival rooms, each one whispering a different version of what the crown should be. Much of what we know about Edwig's missteps comes through later hostile voices, particularly connected to reforming churchmen. That makes the truth slippery, but the political outcome is solid. Conflict with powerful clerical figures and a kingdom that divides, with Edwig's brother Edgar effectively ruling Mercia and Northumbria. The atmosphere of Edwig's rule is one of contested legitimacy. It's not that he lacks a crown, it's that the crown's meaning is being argued over in real time. Who gets to advise the king? Who gets to shape appointments? Who gets land? Who gets remembered kindly? Edwig dies in 959, still young. His reign feels like a brief flare, bright enough to leave a mark, too short to stabilize anything. It also sets the stage for the next king, who will be remembered as a calmer force and who will use the church as a tool of unity. Edgar. The peaceful Edgar's reign, beginning in 959, carries a different temperature, cooler, more ordered, more ceremonial. The nickname The Peaceful is not a claim that the era is free of tension, but rather that Edgar presides over a stronger internal cohesion than his immediate predecessors. This is the period of major monastic reform in England, with influential churchmen reshaping religious life and, by extension, the machinery of governance. The church becomes a partner in royal authority, literate, organized, and capable of projecting a moral narrative that supports the crown. Edgar's coronation in 973 is often described as a deliberate display of sacral kingship, an event crafted to make the monarchy feel inevitable, sanctified, and above ordinary quarrels. Later accounts also describe a symbolic moment at Chester where other rulers acknowledge Edgar's dominance. The precise choreography is debated, but the intention is clear. England has a king who wants to look like the center of a system. In the quiet of his reign, you can sense the crown practicing how to be permanent, how to make power look natural, and therefore harder to challenge. Edward the Martyr. Edward becomes king in 975, and the calm does not last. He is young and the country is again pulled by factions, nobles and churchmen with competing priorities. In this environment, a boy king is a prize as much as a ruler. Edward's death in 978 becomes one of the most haunting episodes of early English monarchy. He is killed at Corfe Castle under circumstances that later tradition frames as murder tied to political ambition. The details are murky, but the consequences are not. His half-brother Ethelred becomes king, and Edward's memory is quickly elevated into sanctity. Edward the Martyr. This sanctification matters. It turns political violence into a moral story, a righteous victim, a sinful court, a warning wrapped in holiness. Relics, shrines, and the language of martyrdom give the crown a spiritual afterimage even when the actual politics are vicious. When you sit with this moment quietly, it feels like a turning point in how royal death is narrated. It is not simply an end. It becomes a weapon, used to justify, condemn, and shape loyalties long after the blood has dried. Ethelred, the Unready. Ethelred begins his reign in 978, and the nickname that follows him, often interpreted as unready, is more like poorly advised or ill-counselled. It's less an insult to intelligence and more an accusation of mismanagement. Under his rule, Viking pressure returns with renewed intensity, and England struggles to respond with coherence. The period is marked by raids, payments, and desperate measures. Danegeld, money paid to buy peace, becomes a recurring feature, and each payment feels like a short exhale that only invites the next demand. Official records indicate enormous sums, extracted through taxation that would have been felt sharply across society. Then comes one of the darkest decisions. In 1002, orders are reportedly issued leading to the killing of Danes in England on St. Brice's Day. How widespread the killings were is debated, but contemporary references suggest real violence and real political calculation. It is a reminder that the crown, when cornered, can lash out at vulnerable targets. Ethelred's reign ends in collapse and exile as Danish power surges. The crown doesn't just wobble, it is taken. And when kingship becomes something you can lose entirely, the whole idea of royal inevitability is suddenly exposed as a carefully maintained illusion. Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, becomes ruler of England in 1013 after Ethelred flees. His conquest is swift enough to feel like a door slammed shut. For the English political world, it's a shock. The crown has been claimed by an outsider with an army and a ruthless clarity of purpose. Sweyn's reign in England is brief. He dies in early 1014, but it matters because it proves something. England can be conquered. The monarchy can be replaced. The story of English kingship is not a sealed lineage. It is a contest. Contemporary accounts suggest the English elite, exhausted by instability, are willing to accept Sweyn under certain conditions, which hints at a practical streak in medieval politics. Loyalty is not always romance. Sometimes it is simply the least deadly option. His death opens the door for Ethelred to return, but not to restore calm, only to restart the struggle. Sweyn's son, Cnut, will not forget what his father proved, and the country, having tasted conquest, will carry that memory like a bruise. In the hush after Sweyn's short rule, you can feel the crown's aura dim slightly. It is still sacred in theory, but in practice it is now painfully, undeniably vulnerable. Cnut, the Great Knut, becomes King of England in 1016, and unlike his father, he stays, settling into power with a calculating steadiness. His reign is one of the most fascinating moments in British royal history because it combines conquest with consolidation. He is a foreign ruler who becomes, in many respects, an English king. Knut builds a North Sea empire holding England, Denmark, and Norway in a web of authority. But the way he governs England is pragmatic. He uses existing systems, works with the church, and distributes power carefully among nobles. The crown becomes less about constant war and more about managed stability. Later stories famously depict Knut trying to command the tide, usually as a lesson in humility. The tale is likely moralized and embellished, but it reveals something important. Even in medieval memory, kingship is presented as limited by forces beyond the ruler's will, nature, God, fate, or simply reality. Knut's reign shows how adaptable monarchy can be. The crown can survive conquest by changing its language and its alliances. Yet beneath the calm, succession remains the danger. When Knut dies in 1035, the system depends on heirs who will not match his competence, and the house he built begins to creak. Harold Harefoot, Harold Harefoot, Knut's son, rules from 1035 to 1040, and his reign feels like a dim corridor compared to his father's bright hall. Succession disputes erupt quickly. Another son, Harthacnut, is delayed by problems in Denmark, and Harold becomes king in the meantime, supported by factions that prefer immediacy over legitimacy. The era is shadowed by political violence. One of the most infamous episodes involves Alfred Etheling, a son of Ethelred, who returns and is captured, blinded, and killed, an event that later stains the reputations of those associated with Harold's rise. The exact chain of responsibility is complex, but the brutality is clear. Harold's kingship is less about grand policy and more about holding on. It shows how quickly order can thin when leadership lacks authority and consensus. When Harold dies in 1040, it's as if the country exhales, not because everything is solved, but because the interim is over. In sleep-soft narration, this reign passes like a cold wind through a doorway, brief, sharp, and unpleasant. The crown is still heavy, but it is wobbling from hand to hand, searching for a steadier grip. Harthacnut. Harthacnut becomes king in 1040, and his reign immediately carries the feel of retribution. Harold is dead, and Harthacnut returns with the authority of a rightful heir, yet also with the anger of someone who believes something was stolen. His rule is often remembered for harsh taxation, tied to the cost of maintaining a fleet. Official records and later chroniclers emphasize the burden, and accounts of unrest appear. There are stories of violent responses to tax collectors and harsh punishments in turn. This is a kingdom trying to pay for security while resenting the bill. Harthacnut's death in 1042 is sudden, collapsing at a feast according to later narration. Whether the details are exactly right or not, the result is decisive. The Danish line ends in England, and the throne returns to the old royal house through Edward, later called the Confessor. Harthacnut's short reign leaves the impression of a ruler who never fully settled, always half anchored in Denmark, half in England, and never quite at peace in either. In the calm after his death, England steps toward a different kind of monarchy, one shaped as much by holiness and symbolism as by swords. Edward the Confessor. Edward becomes king in 1042, and his reign feels quieter, more devotional, more courtly, more focused on legitimacy through sanctity. Later generations will remember him as the Confessor, a title that places spiritual identity beside political authority. In a world where the crown can be taken, holiness becomes another kind of armor. Edward's court is strongly influenced by the powerful Godwin family, especially Godwin's son Harold. This relationship is tense, sometimes cooperative, sometimes brittle. The king's lack of an heir becomes the central problem of the reign, a slow-building dread that everyone can see but nobody can neatly solve. The building of Westminster Abbey becomes one of Edward's defining legacies. Stone rises, carved and arranged with an ambition that makes the monarchy feel timeless. It is architecture as argument. The crown belongs here, permanently, in sacred space. But the succession question remains a knife on the table. When Edward dies in January 1066, the country faces a choice that is not merely legal, but existential. Rival claims begin to sharpen. Oaths, promises, and interpretations clash. The crown, again, is revealed as both sacred and dangerously contestable. Harold Godwinson. Harold is crowned in January 1066, and his reign is famously short, barely long enough for the ink to dry on the idea of him as king. Yet short does not mean simple. Harold is the kind of royal figure who arrives at the top through competence and power networks rather than pure bloodline inevitability, and that makes his kingship both impressive and vulnerable. The year becomes a storm of invasions. In September, Harold marches north to face Harald Hardrada of Norway and wins at Stamford Bridge, often portrayed as a hard-fought victory that drains strength and time. Almost immediately, he must race south to confront William of Normandy, who has landed with an army and a claim. The Battle of Hastings in October 1066 is the hinge. Harold dies, and with him the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king. The imagery is heavy, a field, a standard, the end of one era and the violent opening of another. Harold's story is often told as tragedy, and it fits that shape, but it's also a lesson in timing and legitimacy. He is king in the most dangerous moment possible, when the crown is less a jewel and more a target painted on the head. The next king will take England and remake it. William the Conqueror. William becomes king after 1066, and everything changes, not overnight, but relentlessly. The monarchy becomes Norman, French-speaking and intensely focused on control. Castles rise like clenched fists in stone. Land is redistributed on a massive scale. The elite shifts, and with it the language and culture of power. William's rule is conquest followed by administration. Resistance is met with punishment so severe it echoes for generations. The harrying of the north around 1069 to 1070 is described in grim terms by later chroniclers: devastation, famine, ruin. Numbers are hard to pin down, and medieval reporting can be dramatic, but the broad reality is accepted. The north is broken to secure the realm. Then comes Domesday Book in 1086, a survey of land and resources so thorough it feels almost modern, like the kingdom turned into data. Its governance as inventory, and it signals a monarchy determined to know exactly what it owns. William's kingship is not gentle, but it is foundational. He turns England into a feudal machine tied to his authority. He also binds the English crown to continental politics through Normandy, a connection that will cause centuries of conflict. In the quiet aftermath of conquest, the crown does not merely continue. It becomes something sharper, more centralized, more extractive, more permanently armed. William II. Rufus, William II, called Rufus, takes the throne in 1087, and his reign feels like a hard, bright glare compared to his father's grim solidity. He is often portrayed as forceful, irreverent, and quarrelsome with the church. Contemporary accounts can be hostile, especially from clerical writers, which means some descriptions may be coloured by moral judgment. Still, the political shape is clear. Tension with religious authorities and a strong focus on royal revenue. Rufus is a king who needs money for campaigns, for control, for the sheer maintenance of power. Offices and favours become sources of income. The crown's relationship to the church becomes transactional, sometimes openly antagonistic. This is monarchy as pressure. His death in 1100 is one of history's eerie scenes, killed by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Was it an accident, a conspiracy, or simply the lethal risk of medieval sport? The truth is uncertain, and that uncertainty is part of the legend. What matters is the speed of the succession that follows. Within hours, his brother Henry moves decisively. A crown is taken, promises are made, and the political world pivots. Rufus leaves behind an image of royal power that is strong but abrasive, and a kingdom that is learning again that a sudden death can rearrange everything before the body is even cold. Henry the Vine. Henry the I becomes king in 1100 and immediately presents himself as a restorer, issuing a charter promising better governance, as if words might calm a nervous realm. He is clever, administratively minded, and deeply invested in controlling both nobles and churchmen through systems rather than sheer intimidation. His reign strengthens the machinery of royal government. The exchequer develops as a way to manage finances, and record-keeping becomes more regular. The crown is learning to operate like a continuous entity, not just the personality of whoever wears it, but the defining tragedy is personal and political at once. In 1120, the White Ship disaster kills Henry's only legitimate son, William Adeline. Contemporary accounts treat it as catastrophe, drowning, chaos, the extinguishing of an expected future. After that night, succession becomes a slow-moving crisis. Henry names his daughter Matilda as heir and forces oaths of recognition, but oaths in medieval politics can be fragile things, strong when convenient, ignored when dangerous. When Henry dies in 1135, the question is not whether he ruled well, but whether the system he built can survive the argument over who should inherit it. The answer will be messy, it will be violent, and it will show how quickly a well-run kingdom can become a battleground when the royal line fractures. Stephen of Blois. Stephen takes the throne in 1135, and his reign becomes a long demonstration of what happens when a crown is technically claimed but not firmly accepted. Matilda, Henry I's designated heir, is bypassed. Stephen moves quickly, secures support in key places, and is crowned. But the legitimacy problem doesn't dissolve, it hardens. The period that follows is later remembered as the Anarchy, though even that label is a kind of argument. Some regions experience intense disorder, others keep a rough stability. Still, the defining feature is civil war, shifting loyalties, castles popping up in defiance, noble families treating the realm like a board for private games. Stephen is not a monster in the way later propaganda sometimes suggests. He can be generous, brave, personally charismatic, but he is also inconsistent, and in civil conflict, inconsistency is fatal. When he captures Matilda in 1141, he seems near victory, then he loses ground. When Matilda is cornered, she escapes. The war breathes in and out like a fever. By the end, exhaustion becomes its own political force. A compromise forms. Stephen will remain king, but Matilda's son, Henry, will succeed him. Stephen dies in 1154, and the throne passes without another major rupture, an achievement in itself after years of instability. The lesson of Stephen's reign is quiet and brutal. The crown is not only a symbol, it is a contract. If too many powerful people refuse to honor it, the realm fractures into smaller, hungrier pieces. Henry II becomes king in 1154, and it feels like a gate slamming shut on chaos. He is energetic, intelligent, and relentless, less a decorative monarch than a force of nature in a crown. He also inherits something extraordinary. Through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, his rule is tied to vast lands in France, creating what later historians call the Angevin Empire. England, in Henry's hands, becomes more governed. Legal reforms expand. Royal justice grows sharper. The crown becomes present in local life through courts and officials, an intrusion that can be resented, but also creates predictability. Historical records show a deliberate effort to pull authority away from private barons and toward the king's system. But Henry's reign also contains one of the most infamous clashes between crown and church. His conflict with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Their friendship curdles into political warfare over who controls clerics and courts. In 1170, Becket is murdered in Canterbury Cathedral by men linked to Henry's circle. Whether Henry directly ordered it is disputed, but contemporary accounts strongly suggest his words and rage created the atmosphere that made it possible. The consequences are severe. Becket becomes a martyr, Henry does public penance, and the monarchy learns, again, that violence against sacred figures can boomerang into moral catastrophe. Henry's later years are haunted by rebellion from his own son. Power is not only external, it is domestic. When Henry dies in 1189, he leaves a stronger system, but a family fracture that will continue to bleed. Richard the Fay. Richard becomes king in 1189, and immediately feels like a different kind of monarch. Less administrator, more legend. He is known as the Lionheart, and his reign is dominated by the Third Crusade. England, under Richard, is a source of money and manpower for campaigns far away, while the king himself spends little time actually in his kingdom. This creates a strange royal atmosphere, a crown that is physically absent but financially heavy. Taxes rise, offices are sold, the machinery of government runs, but it runs to fund war and ransom rather than local improvement. When Richard is captured returning from the crusade and held for ransom, the cost is enormous and widely felt. Official records indicate the kingdom is squeezed hard to buy back its king. Richard's heroism is real in the sense that he is an effective commander, and contemporaries admire his military talent. But his kingship also reveals something uncomfortable. A medieval king can be celebrated while treating his realm as a bank. He dies in 1199 from a wound during a minor siege in France, an anticlimactic end for a crusading icon. And in that moment, the crown passes to his brother John, who will inherit not only the throne, but the resentment, the debts, and the fragile balance of the Angevin world. John becomes king in 1199 and is often remembered through a grim lens. Misrule, loss, humiliation, and forced concession. He is not without intelligence, but his politics are brittle, his relationships with nobles corrosive, and his luck consistently poor. The defining early disaster is the loss of Normandy in 1204 to the French King Philip II. This is not merely a territorial shift, it is a psychological one. The English crown's continental base fractures and John's authority looks diminished. To compensate, he demands more from England, more money, more obedience, more submission. He also clashes with the Church over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. When Pope Innocent III imposes Stephen Langton, John resists, leading to England being placed under interdict and John himself excommunicated. Eventually he submits and even makes England a papal fief in 1213, a move that may have been tactically clever, but feels humiliating to many. All of this pressure funnels into 1215 and Magna Carta. The document is not modern democracy in embryo, but it is a forced acknowledgement that the king is not above law and custom. John agrees under duress, then attempts to overturn it, plunging the realm into further conflict. John dies in 1216, and his death feels like the end of a bad storm. But the storm's debris remains. The crown passes to his young son, Henry III, and the monarchy survives by doing something it rarely likes: compromise. Henry III becomes king in 1216 as a child, and his early reign is shaped by regents and the urgent need to stabilize the realm after civil war. In these years, the crown's survival depends not on personal authority, but on careful negotiation. Magna Carta is reissued in revised forms, less a sudden miracle and more an ongoing political tool, something the monarchy learns to live with because the alternative is chaos. As Henry grows into adulthood, his reign becomes long, one of the longest in medieval England, and in many ways defined by taste, devotion, and the problem of money. He invests heavily in Westminster, rebuilding the abbey in a grand Gothic style that turns stone into theology. The court becomes more elaborate, more consciously royal, but Henry's governance is frequently criticized by contemporaries. Foreign favourites, especially from Poitou and Savoy through his marriage alliances, gain influence, fueling baronial resentment. Financial demands increase, particularly tied to Henry's ambitious and ultimately failed schemes to secure a Sicilian crown for his son. This pressure contributes to the crisis of the 1250s and 1260s. The provisions of Oxford in 1258 attempt to impose baronial control over royal government, a kind of forced reform. Conflict escalates into the Second Barons' War, led by Simon de Montfort, who in 1265 summons a parliament that includes not just nobles and clergy, but representatives of towns, an important development, though not yet anything like modern representation. Henry regains control, but the reign ends with a monarchy altered, the crown still powerful but increasingly entangled with assemblies and expectations. When he dies in 1272, his son Edward the Firm inherits a more structured realm and a more demanding political class. Edward I becomes king in 1272, and he arrives with the energy of someone who believes authority should be clear and unquestioned. He is tall, formidable, and deeply invested in law, conquest, and the expansion of royal reach. His reign often feels like an iron framework being hammered into place. Edward's legal reforms and administrative inquiries are extensive. He pushes the idea that the crown should know, record, and enforce. Parliament becomes more regular, called not as an occasional dramatic event, but as part of governance, especially for taxation. It's not democracy. It's the crown asking for money and in return being forced to listen more than it would prefer. Edward's reign is also defined by conquest, especially in Wales. Campaigns culminate in the defeat of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd and the construction of massive castles, Caernarfon Conwy Harlech, stone statements of domination. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 formalises English control. Then comes Scotland. Edward attempts to assert overlordship, leading to wars that will produce figures like William Wallace and later Robert the Bruce. Edward is relentless. He is also aging and increasingly consumed by the struggle. He dies in 1307 while campaigning, still trying to force Scotland into submission. Edward I leaves behind a monarchy that is more legally articulated and more militarily ambitious. He also leaves a legacy of grievance, especially in the lands he sought to dominate. The crown, under Edward, becomes something like a machine, effective, heavy, and unkind to anything caught beneath it. Edward II becomes king in 1307, and immediately the atmosphere shifts. Where his father was forceful and widely feared, Edward II is often portrayed as indulgent, easily influenced, and politically maladroit. Some of this may be exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, but the structural reality is clear. His reign is dominated by favoritism and conflict with the nobility. The central tension revolves around Edward's close relationships with men like Piers Gaveston and later the Despensers. Nobles resent the influence and rewards given to these favourites, interpreting them as threats to their own status and to the balance of power. Opposition hardens into rebellion, and governance becomes a constant struggle between the king and powerful faction. Militarily, Edward's reign suffers a catastrophic humiliation at Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce's Scottish forces defeat the English. This loss is not just tactical. It signals that Scotland cannot be crushed by sheer will, and it undermines Edward's aura. The reign ends in a coup. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, invade in 1326. Edward is deposed in 1327, replaced by his son. His death in captivity later becomes the subject of lurid rumour and disputed accounts. Some sources suggest murder, others imply uncertainty. The sensational stories may be propaganda, but the political truth is brutal enough. A king can be removed. Edward II's reign exposes a dangerous fact about monarchy. It is not automatically stable. If the elite withdraws support, the crown can be pried off, no matter how sacred it claims to be. Edward III becomes king in 1327 as a teenager, but he quickly moves to seize real power. In 1330 he stages a coup against Mortimer, ending the regency influence and announcing himself as a king who will not be controlled. The reign that follows is long, glamorous in its chivalric storytelling, and soaked in war. Edward III's major legacy is the start of the 100 Years' War with France. His claim to the French throne becomes both a political argument and a justification for campaigns that will define English identity for centuries. Battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 become legends. Archers mud, armoured nobles falling, and an English military system learning how to win spectacularly. At home, Edward fosters the idea of knighthood and courtly honour, founding the Order of the Garter. The monarchy becomes theatre, splendour as a tool of legitimacy, but the reign is also shaped by catastrophe. The Black Death arrives in 1348 to 1349, killing an enormous portion of the population. Contemporary accounts describe terror, labour shortages, social upheaval, and the collapse of old assumptions. The Crown's response includes attempts to control wages and movement through laws, revealing a monarchy trying to freeze society in place while reality shifts beneath it. Edward's later years are less triumphant. He ages, governance falters, and court politics become sour. When he dies in 1377, his heir is his grandson, Richard II, a child king inheriting war, social tension, and a monarchy that has grown accustomed to grandeur without necessarily being able to pay for it. Richard II becomes king in 1377, and his early reign is framed by youth, uncertainty, and a realm under pressure. Taxes for war continue. Social conditions are strained after the Black Death. In 1381, the peasants' revolt erupts, a dramatic and frightening challenge to authority. Richard, still a teenager, meets rebels and makes promises. Then the revolt is crushed, and the promises do not hold. The episode becomes a lesson in how fragile order can be. As Richard grows, his kingship becomes more personal and more controversial. He emphasizes royal dignity, ceremony, and the idea that the king's authority should be exalted. Critics interpret this as arrogance and detachment. Tensions with powerful nobles intensify, particularly with those who see Richard as favoring certain courtiers and punishing opponents through legal mechanisms. The conflict escalates into a constitutional crisis. Richard attempts to rule with an increasingly authoritarian style, and his enemies gather around Henry Bolingbroke. In 1399, while Richard is away in Ireland, Bolingbroke returns claiming his inheritance but quickly moving toward the throne itself. Richard is deposed and Henry IV takes the crown. Richard dies in captivity in 1400, and while the exact circumstances are debated, the result is clear. Deposition becomes precedent. Once a king has been removed and replaced successfully, the sacred aura of monarchy is permanently punctured. The crown remains powerful, yes, but it is now also demonstrably conditional. Henry IV. Henry IV takes the throne in 1399, and his reign carries the constant hum of insecurity. He is a usurper in the eyes of those loyal to Richard II, and even those who support him understand the danger. If one king can be deposed, another can be too. Henry spends much of his reign putting out fires. Rebellions erupt early. The Percy family, crucial supporters, turn against him, leading to conflict that includes the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. Henry's ability to survive these challenges becomes a defining feature. He is a king of endurance rather than splendour. Wales also rises under Owain Glyndwr, creating a prolonged and costly struggle. Henry's health deteriorates over time, and the image of a sick king trying to keep a contested crown steady has a weary inevitability. Parliament becomes more important, partly because Henry needs taxation and therefore must negotiate. The monarchy is increasingly tied to political bargaining, even as it tries to project absolute authority. Henry dies in 1413, and the crown passes to his son, Henry V. The transition matters. Legitimacy can be strengthened by success, and Henry V will seek that success in the most traditional royal way possible: war. Henry V becomes king in 1413, and his reign is a concentrated burst of martial kingship. He is often remembered as the ideal warrior monarch, disciplined, charismatic, capable of inspiring loyalty. He also understands image. He presents himself as pious, serious, and purposeful, someone who makes kingship feel inevitable again. His defining achievement is the campaign in France that leads to the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Contemporary and later accounts make it iconic. Outnumbered English forces, muddy fields, arrows cutting through armoured ranks. The reality is complex: strategy, terrain, French disorganisation, but the outcome is undeniable: a staggering English victory that becomes national myth. Henry's subsequent successes lead to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognises him as heir to the French throne and regent of France, and he marries Catherine of Valois. For a moment, the dream of a dual monarchy seems within reach. Then Henry dies in 1422, young, leaving an infant son, Henry VI, to inherit both England and an unstable claim in France. Henry V's reign is often remembered as glory, but it is also a trap. It sets expectations that cannot be sustained, and it leaves a child king with a war machine that requires constant feeding. Henry VI becomes king as an infant in 1422, and his reign stretches long, but it is defined by weakness, mental illness, and the collapse of English fortunes in France. During his minority, regents govern in his name, and the war continues. Over time, English positions in France unravel, and victories turn into retreats. The emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429 shifts the French momentum dramatically. Contemporary accounts, English and French, treat her as extraordinary, whether as inspiration, symbol, or threat. Under her influence and broader French resurgence, English claims shrink. By 1453, the Hundred Years' War effectively ends with England holding only Calais. At home, Henry's personal rule proves fragile. He is pious and gentle, but not politically decisive. He suffers episodes of mental breakdown, leaving governance in the hands of rival factions. This instability ignites the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between Lancastrians and Yorkists. The conflict is brutal and often bewildering, marked by battles, shifting allegiances, and repeated captures of the king. Henry is deposed in 1461 by Edward IV, briefly restored in 1470, then deposed again. He dies in 1471 in the Tower of London. Official certainty about the exact cause is elusive, but the political interpretation is hard to avoid. He is removed permanently to secure the new regime. Henry VI's reign reveals monarchy at its most vulnerable. When the king cannot command, the crown becomes a prize fought over by sharper hands. Edward IV becomes king in 1461, and his reign feels like a sudden surge of confidence. He is physically imposing, politically bold, and capable of attracting loyalty through charisma and reward. The Yorkist cause under Edward presents itself as a restoration of competence after the chaos of Henry VI's rule. Edward wins major battles, including Towton in 1461, often described as one of the bloodiest conflicts on English soil. The victory secures his throne, but the realm remains unstable. Warwick, the kingmaker, initially Edward's strongest supporter, later turns against him, furious at Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville and the rise of her family's influence. This fracture leads to Edward's temporary deposition in 1470 and the brief restoration of Henry VI. Edward returns in 1471, wins at Barnet and Tewkesbury, and reclaims the crown. The cycle shows how quickly power can reverse in this era, how the crown is balanced on alliances that can crack. After 1471, Edward rules more securely. Trade and finances improve. The court becomes more settled, yet the succession remains dangerous. When Edward dies suddenly in 1483, leaving two young sons, the political world shifts again with chilling speed. Edward VIII's reign is a reminder that victory in civil war can create a king, but it does not necessarily create safety. The crown is still surrounded by hungry men, and young heirs are especially vulnerable. Edward V becomes king in 1483 as a boy, and his reign is the shortest kind, more a legal moment than an exercised rule. He is never crowned. Instead, he becomes the centre of one of England's most enduring mysteries, the Princes in the Tower. Edward's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, takes control as protector. Claims are raised that Edward IV's marriage was invalid, making Edward V illegitimate. Parliament passes an act supporting this claim, and Richard takes the throne as Richard III. Edward V and his brother Richard are lodged in the Tower of London, and then they disappear from public view. Contemporary rumours spread rapidly. Later accounts accuse Richard III of murder, but certainty is elusive. The absence of definitive evidence leaves a fog that history has never fully cleared. What matters, beyond the mystery, is the cold lesson. Royal childhood offers no protection. Being the king can mean being a hostage. The crown, in a succession crisis, becomes something that consumes its own. Edward VI's reign is like a candle blown out before it can illuminate anything. It exists mostly as a haunting, proof that monarchy is not only pageantry, but also fear, confinement, and the quiet erasure of inconvenient heirs. Richard III becomes king in 1483, and his reign is one of the most debated in English history. The traditional Tudor narrative paints him as a villain, crooked, ruthless, a monster in velvet. Modern reassessments suggest a more complex figure, capable administrator committed to law but undeniably a usurper whose legitimacy is shadowed by the fate of the princes. Richard attempts reforms, including measures aimed at fairer legal process. He builds support in parts of the north, but his position is precarious. He lacks the broad dynastic security that a long-established line provides, and his enemies gather around Henry Tudor, a relatively distant claimant with a strong sense of timing. In 1485, Henry Tudor invades. Richard meets him at Bosworth Field. Richard's death in battle becomes one of the defining theatrical moments of English monarchy. A king fighting, desperate, close-quartered, refusing to flee. His defeat ends the Plantagenet era and begins the Tudor dynasty. Whether Richard murdered the princes remains disputed, and the uncertainty itself becomes part of his legacy. The story of Richard III is less about one man's nature and more about how history is written by winners. The Tudors needed him to be a villain to make their own rise look like salvation. In the quiet after Bosworth, the crown passes to a new house, one that will cling to legitimacy with a fierce, anxious grip, because it knows exactly how easily a king can fall. Henry VII. Henry VII takes the throne in 1485, and the first thing you feel in his reign is caution, careful footsteps on a floor that still remembers blood. He wins at Bosworth, but victory alone doesn't guarantee safety. His claim is not overwhelmingly strong, so he builds legitimacy the way a patient builder lays stone: marriage, paperwork, money, and time. His marriage to Elizabeth of York helps stitch the dynastic wound, at least on the surface. Symbols bloom, the Tudor rose, the language of unity, but the fear of rebellion lingers. Pretenders appear, most famously Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, each claiming to be a lost prince. Some of these movements have real backing, which tells you how uncertain the political world still is. People don't rebel only because they believe. They rebel because they hope. Henry's genius and his coldness lies in finance and control. He uses bonds and recognizances, financial promises that can become crushing penalties, to keep nobles obedient. He avoids expensive wars when he can. He hoards stability like treasure. By the end of his reign, the monarchy feels less like a prize snatched from chaos and more like a managed institution. When Henry dies in 1509, he leaves his son a strong treasury and a steadier throne. The tragedy, quiet but sharp, is that the son who inherits this stability will spend it like a man tossing gold into a furnace, convinced the flames are proof of greatness. Henry VIII. Henry VIII becomes king in 1509, and at first the mood is bright. Young, athletic, confident, he looks like a Renaissance prince. He wants glory. He wants to be seen. The court becomes louder, richer, more extravagant, as if England is trying on a new costume made of velvet and ambition. But Henry's reign turns on an intimate, frightening obsession. An heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon does not produce a surviving son, and the succession anxiety grows into desperation. When Henry seeks an annulment and the Pope refuses, England breaks from Rome. The king becomes head of the Church of England. A revolution carried out not by crowds in the street but by authority at the top, parliamentary acts, oaths, and the steady pressure of royal will. Then comes the dissolution of the monasteries. Religious houses are dismantled, lands seized, wealth redirected. The scale is enormous. The consequences ripple outward. Social support structures disrupted, local identities altered, and the crown enriched, at least temporarily. Henry's monarchy becomes heavier and more intrusive, and resistance is crushed, sometimes brutally, as in the Pilgrimage of Grace. His marriages, 6 of them, become a grim rhythm. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Behind the rhyme and legend are real lives, real fear, and a court that learns to treat intimacy as politics. 2 queens are executed, one dies in childbirth, one survives by careful navigation. By the time Henry dies in 1547, the monarchy is more powerful, more feared, and more entangled with religion than ever before. He leaves a child heir and a kingdom transformed, its old spiritual scaffolding ripped away and replaced with a new, unstable framework that will shake violently in the reigns to come. Edward VI. Edward VI becomes king in 1547 at the age of 9, and his reign is a reminder that monarchy can be a mask worn by others. Real power lies with regents, first Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, then John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. each attempting to steer the realm while presenting their decisions as the will of a boy. Religious change accelerates. Under Edward, England moves decisively toward Protestant reform. New prayer books, altered services, dismantled imagery, and a sharper rejection of old Catholic practices. For some, this feels like purification. For others, it feels like theft of tradition, of comfort, of the familiar rhythm of worship that anchored everyday life. Economic and social strain is visible too. Enclosures, inflation, unrest. The period sees rebellions like Kett's Rebellion in 1549, where complaints mix local grievance with broader frustration at a world tilting toward inequality. The crown responds, as crowns often do when frightened, with force and punishment. Edward himself is often described as intelligent and devoutly Protestant, but he is also fragile. He becomes ill, likely tuberculosis, though diagnosis at this distance is uncertain, and the court panics because succession is a loaded weapon. In 1553, as Edward dies, an attempt is made to alter the succession to favour Lady Jane Grey, keeping the throne Protestant. It is a political gamble with human lives as chips. Edward's death does not end his reign so much as ignite the next crisis. Lady Jane Grey. Jane Grey is sometimes called the 9 Days Queen, and her story feels like a whispered tragedy in a palace corridor. She is young, highly educated, and placed on the throne in 1553 by powerful men trying to control succession. In a sense, she is treated less like a monarch and more like a document, something to be signed, displayed, and used. Jane's reign is brief because legitimacy is stronger elsewhere. Mary, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, gathers support rapidly. People who might not love Mary still recognize her claim as more rightful, more grounded in the accepted line. When Mary enters London, Jane's support collapses with startling speed. The shift reveals something crucial about monarchy. It relies on consensus as much as force. An army matters, but so does the shared belief that a particular person is supposed to be sovereign. Jane is imprisoned, and though Mary initially seems reluctant to execute her, rebellion and political pressure tighten the noose. Jane is executed in 1554. The image, young royalty beheaded for the convenience of others, hangs over the Tudor story like a cold fog. Jane's brief moment on the throne is less a reign than an alarm bell, showing how religious conflict has turned succession into an emergency, where even a teenage girl can be crowned and killed in the space of a fortnight. Mary. Mary I becomes queen in 1553, and the atmosphere changes immediately. Older, stern, determined, and shaped by years of insecurity. She has lived through her mother's humiliation, her own declaration of illegitimacy, and the violent reshaping of English religion. When she takes the throne, she does not intend to compromise on faith. She intends to restore. Mary attempts to bring England back into communion with Rome. For Catholics, this can feel like righting a wrong. For Protestants, it feels like a threat to conscience and survival. The most infamous legacy of her reign is the persecution of Protestants, burnings that later Protestant narratives emphasize with relentless intensity. The number of executions is documented and substantial. The horror is not only in the deaths, but in the public spectacle, intended as warning. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain adds another layer of anxiety. Many English subjects fear foreign influence, fear being pulled into continental conflicts, fear the crown becoming a satellite. Rebellions flare, including Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, revealing that political resistance and religious fear are entwined. Mary experiences a false pregnancy, then another deep disappointment. The lack of an heir becomes a slow heartbreak and a political crisis. When she dies in 1558, England is exhausted, religiously scarred, and psychologically bruised. Mary's reign is often reduced to cruelty, but it is also a study in certainty. She believes she is saving souls and restoring truth. History, however, measures results as well as intentions. Her policies harden Protestant identity and make the next reign settlement both urgent and, in some eyes, inevitable. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I becomes queen in 1558, and her reign feels like a long exhale after a decade of tightening fear. She is young, politically shrewd, and keenly aware that her survival depends on balancing forces that would happily destroy her. Her first task is religious. She establishes a Protestant settlement that is designed to be durable, neither too radical to provoke universal rebellion, nor too Catholic to betray the direction England has already moved. Elizabeth's court becomes a stage. Splendor is not only vanity, it is strategy. She crafts an image of authority, virgin queen, married to her realm, untouchable and therefore difficult to control. Yet this image comes with a cost. The succession question never truly goes away. Marriage negotiations swirl for years like weather that never fully clears. Her reign is shaped by threats. Mary, Queen of Scots, becomes the most dangerous. Present in England, a rival claimant, a magnet for Catholic plots. After years of imprisonment and conspiracies, Mary is executed in 1587, a decision that haunts the moral atmosphere of the age. It is also a political statement. Elizabeth will not tolerate a living alternative crown. Then comes 1588 and the Spanish Armada. The victory becomes legend. Storms, tactics, fireships, and national myth-making. But even here, the reality is ongoing conflict rather than a single decisive ending. War continues, money bleeds, and the late reign grows tired. Elizabeth's later years carry a dimming mood. Favourites rising and falling, rebellions in Ireland, a sense of a generation ageing out. When she dies in 1603, she leaves no heir, but she leaves something else. A monarchy that has learned how to survive religious civil war by controlling narrative, ceremony, and compromise. The crown passes smoothly to James VI of Scotland, now James I of England. And that smoothness feels almost miraculous after so many decades of tension. James James becomes King of England in 1603, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in one person, and the shift is subtle but profound. A new dynasty arrives, the Stuarts, and with it a king who is intellectual, talkative, and deeply convinced of the divine right of kings. James likes theory. He likes the idea that monarchy is sacred, ordained, and therefore not legitimately questioned. But England is not a kingdom that sits quietly under theory. Parliament expects to be consulted, especially on money. Religious divisions remain sharp, Catholics disappointed by the lack of full toleration, Puritans frustrated by what they see as half measures. Early in the reign, the gunpowder plot of 1605 reveals how explosive the atmosphere can become, and it hardens suspicion against Catholics for generations. James also presides over cultural brilliance. The era of Shakespeare and the King James Bible gives the reign a literary glow, as if words themselves are part of royal legacy. Yet behind the language, tensions build, financial strain, patronage battles, and a court sometimes mocked for extravagance. James's foreign policy aims for peace, but his household politics, favourite scandals and faction, undermine trust. His belief in divine right becomes a fault line, because it collides with a political culture that is already accustomed to bargaining with kings. When James dies in 1625, the crown passes to his son Charles X, who inherits not only the throne, but the unresolved argument about whether a king rules with Parliament, above Parliament, or despite Parliament. Charles thus becomes king in 1625, and his reign is the slow approach of thunder. He is dignified, reserved, intensely convinced of royal authority, and less flexible than his father. Almost immediately he clashes with Parliament over money and the limits of power. In a system where a king needs funds, conflict over taxation is never just about finances. It's about who gets to say no. Religious tension deepens under Charles, especially through policies associated with Archbishop Laud, which many Protestants interpret as drifting toward Catholic-style ceremony. Fear spreads, fear of secret plots, fear of tyranny, fear that the kingdom's identity is being rewritten without consent. In 1629, Charles begins a period often called personal rule, governing without Parliament for 11 years. He finds alternative ways to raise revenue, including controversial measures like ship money. The legitimacy of these methods is fiercely disputed, and the resentment is not confined to elites. It spreads. The crisis detonates when Charles tries to impose religious changes on Scotland, provoking rebellion. Needing funds to fight, he recalls Parliament, only to find that Parliament has its own list of demands. The relationship collapses into open conflict, and in 1642, civil war begins. The war is not only a clash of armies, but of political principles. What is a king? What is obedience? What is the nation? The fighting is brutal, intimate, and divisive. Charles is captured, tried, and executed in 1649, an act so shocking it reverberates like a cannon blast through European monarchy. His death is a rupture, a king publicly killed by his subjects, with legal and moral arguments marshalled to justify it. The crown is removed, and for a time, there will be no king at all. The interregnum. After Charles I is executed in 1649, the monarchy doesn't wobble. It is removed. For a moment, England becomes a place where the idea of kingship is treated as optional, even dangerous, a dramatic experiment conducted with real blood still drying on the block. The country is declared a commonwealth, and the language of rule changes. Instead of by the grace of God, authority is justified by victory, Parliament, and the claim that tyranny has been cut away. But even in a kingdom without a king, power doesn't evaporate. It simply changes costume. The court becomes a committee, then a council, then, inevitably, a single dominating figure. Old ceremonies are rejected, yet new rituals of authority creep in. Uniforms, titles, guarded doors, carefully staged public appearances. Human beings seem to need a centre, and the state begins to grow one. And in the background, Britain's other kingdoms and territories, Scotland and Ireland most painfully, are pulled into this experiment through conquest, coercion, and violent settlement. Without a crowned head, the realm is not gentler. In some ways, it becomes sharper, because it no longer has to pretend that mercy is a royal virtue. Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell rises from parliamentary commander to the gravitational centre of the new regime. By 1653, he becomes Lord Protector, never called king, but holding power in a way that looks from a distance uncomfortably familiar. The irony is almost audible. A revolution against monarchy producing a near monarch, simply with different words stitched onto the robe. Cromwell's rule is marked by moral intensity and hard practicality. He wants a godly commonwealth, a society disciplined into righteousness. That vision can produce reform, but it also produces surveillance, censorship, and a public culture that feels policed. Theatres close, celebrations are restricted, pleasure becomes suspicious. His legacy is inseparable from Ireland. Campaigns begun in 1649, especially episodes like Drogheda and Wexford, are remembered with lasting trauma and bitterness. The numbers and exact details are debated by historians, but contemporary accounts and later memory agree on the essential truth. The conquest is brutal, and its consequences echo for centuries in land ownership, displacement, and resentment. Cromwell is also a ruler who understands money, army loyalty, and the cold value of stability. He summons parliaments, dismisses them, negotiates, then threatens. The government lurches between ideals and necessity, between scripture and soldiers. When Cromwell dies in 1658, the question is immediate and simple. Can a regime built on one man's authority survive his absence? Richard Cromwell. Richard Cromwell succeeds his father as Lord Protector in 1658, and the mood changes fast. He is not Oliver. He lacks the same military reputation, the same iron certainty, and, most importantly, the same grip on the army. If Oliver Cromwell is a storm held in a clenched fist, Richard is a calm hand trying to hold the same storm without being believed. Factions open like cracks in ice. Parliament, army leaders, and political opportunists begin to tug at the state from different directions, testing what will break first. Richard does not last. He resigns in 1659, and his exit has a strange quietness, as if the country has collectively decided the experiment has run out of fuel. Without a unifying figure, the Commonwealth splinters into unstable arrangements. Committees, councils, and shifting military control. The absence of monarchy is no longer revolutionary, it is exhausting. In the end, the restoration of the crown does not happen because everyone suddenly falls in love with kings again. It happens because the alternatives have become a maze of competing authorities, and many people decide a familiar symbol is better than endless uncertainty. Charles II. Charles II returns in 1660, and the restoration feels like the opening of windows after years in a locked room. The court becomes lively, theatrical, and openly indulgent in contrast to Puritan restraint. There's music again, laughter, bright clothes, and the sense that the monarchy is determined to prove it is not merely a government, but a culture. Yet the return is not pure celebration, it is also carefully negotiated. Charles has learned that a crown can be cut off. He understands that survival requires flexibility, charm, and a willingness to let institutions think they matter, because they do. His reign is filled with calamities that test the idea of royal protection. The Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666 make the capital feel cursed. Contemporary accounts describe fear, mass death, and the eerie glow of the burning city. The monarchy's role is complicated, sometimes present, sometimes distant, often blamed regardless. Charles's court is famous for mistresses and scandal, but beneath that is sharp political maneuvering. Religious conflict remains central. Suspicion of Catholic plots grows, fueled by episodes like the Popish plot panic in 1678, widely understood now as a fabricated conspiracy, but at the time deadly in its consequences. Fear becomes policy, and policy becomes persecution. The succession question returns like a recurring headache because Charles has no legitimate heir. His brother James is Catholic, and many in England dread what that might mean. Charles tries to balance the realm on a thin wire, avoiding extremes, soothing factions, surviving. When he dies in 1685, the monarchy passes to James II, and the wire snaps almost immediately. James II becomes king in 1685, and his reign has the tense feeling of a door slowly closing. He is openly Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, and while some subjects might tolerate that privately, James attempts something more ambitious, to reshape the religious landscape through royal authority. He promotes Catholics into positions of power, uses declarations to suspend or bypass laws, and tests the limits of obedience. To James, this is rightful monarchy exercising its prerogative. To his opponents, it looks like a blueprint for absolutism, one that could erase Parliament's role and change the nation's identity. Rebellion flares early with the Duke of Monmouth's uprising in 1685, which ends in defeat and the infamous bloody assizes under Judge Jeffreys. Punishment is harsh, designed to warn, but warning can backfire. It can turn fear into determination. The tipping point comes in 1688 when James produces a male heir, threatening a lasting Catholic dynasty. A crisis that might have been endured temporarily suddenly looks permanent. Key figures invite William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to intervene. William lands, support drains from James, and James flees. The episode is later called the Glorious Revolution, a name that polishes the edges. It is comparatively less bloody in England than many upheavals, but it is still a forced transfer of power, with enormous constitutional consequences. James dies in exile, and the crown, once again, proves it can be replaced, this time with Parliament asserting that it has the right to shape the succession. William III and Mary II. Mary II and William III take the throne together in 1689, a rare dual monarchy that reflects the political compromise of the moment. Mary is James II's daughter, offering legitimacy by blood. William brings military power and European alliances, especially against France. Together they represent a new idea, monarchy under conditions. The Bill of Rights in 1689 becomes one of the defining documents of the constitutional monarchy, limiting royal power, strengthening parliament, and shaping the rules of succession. It does not create modern democracy, but it draws sharper boundaries around the crown. After the upheavals of the century, England is trying to build a system that can survive bad kings. Their reign is shaped by war, especially against Louis XIII's France. Money and taxation remain central, which means Parliament's role grows because the state needs funding. The financial machinery of government expands, including the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, part of a broader transformation toward a modern fiscal state. Mary dies in 1694, and William rules alone afterward. He is often seen as more soldier statesman than beloved monarch, distant, practical, and not particularly warm in popular imagination. But his reign matters because it embeds the principle that monarchy is intertwined with parliamentary governance. When William dies in 1702, the crown passes to Mary's sister Anne, and the kingdom stands on the brink of a new political entity, Great Britain. Anne becomes queen in 1702, and her reign is often remembered with a kind of melancholy dignity. She is the last Stuart monarchs, and her personal life is marked by profound loss, multiple pregnancies, no surviving heir. The succession anxiety does not vanish, it simply moves into the future like a shadow. Politically, Anne's reign is enormous. In 1707, the Acts of Union unite England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. This is not a simple, happy marriage of nations. It involves bargaining, economic pressure, and deep resistance in parts of Scotland. But the result is transformative. One parliament, one state, one crown ruling a newly defined political body. Her reign is also shaped by the War of the Spanish Succession, with figures like the Duke of Marlborough becoming military legends. Victory and diplomacy shift the balance of European power, and Britain's global ambitions begin to sharpen. At court, politics becomes increasingly party-driven, with Whigs and Tories battling for influence. Anne herself is sometimes depicted as a figure pulled between factions, but she is not merely passive. She has preferences, loyalties, and a sense of monarchy's dignity, though the ground beneath her is increasingly controlled by Parliament and party machinery. When Anne dies in 1714, the Stuart line ends on the throne, and the crown passes to a German prince chosen by law, George of Hanover. It is one of the clearest demonstrations that the monarchy is now, in practice, a constitutional arrangement shaped by Parliament's decisions. George I, Sir George the Beos, becomes king in 1714, and the mood is oddly distant. He is the Elector of Hanover, brought to the British throne through the Act of Settlement to ensure a Protestant succession. He speaks little English at first, and many of his interests remain tied to his German territories. The monarchy, for a time, feels like it has moved slightly off stage. Yet George's reign matters because it accelerates a shift. Political power increasingly flows through ministers and parliament rather than the sovereign's personal command. The role that later becomes Prime Minister grows in practice, even if the title remains informal and contested. Robert Walpole rises as a dominant figure, managing parliament and government in ways that shape the future. George faces rebellion from Jacobites who support the exiled Stuart line, particularly the uprising of 1715. The revolt fails, but it reveals that legitimacy is still argued in blood as well as law. The new dynasty is not universally loved, it is simply installed. Court life under George can feel less glamorous than earlier eras, but the state itself becomes more financially and administratively sophisticated. Britain is beginning to operate like a modern power: debt, institutions, patronage, and parliamentary manoeuvring. When George dies in 1727, the crown passes to his son George II, and the Hanoverian line continues, still foreign in origin, but increasingly embedded in British political life. George II. George II becomes king in 1727, and his reign carries a steadier rhythm. He is more comfortable in Britain than his father, though Hanover remains part of his identity and strategic concerns. The monarchy continues its gradual evolution into something less commanding and more symbolic, while ministers and parliament do the grinding work of governance. George II is notable for being the last British monarch to lead troops in battle at Dettingen in 1743 during the War of the Austrian Succession. The image is striking, a king physically present in war, like an older medieval echo. But the broader reality is that Britain's wars are increasingly fought through generals, fleets, and financial systems rather than the monarch's sword arm. The Jacobite threat returns dramatically in 1745 with Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, leading an uprising that reaches deep into England before collapsing. The defeat at Culloden in 1746 ends the immediate Jacobite dream and is followed by harsh measures in the Highlands. The crown's survival is secured, but the cost is cultural devastation and long memory of grievance. Domestic politics remains dominated by ministers, with figures like Walpole earlier and later, others managing power in Parliament. The monarchy's role becomes less about direct command and more about influence, patronage, and continuity. When George II dies in 1760, he leaves a stronger global Britain to his grandson George III, a king whose long reign will contain both empire's expansion and its fractures. George III becomes king in 1760, and at first there is a sense of renewal. He is born in Britain, speaks English as his first language, and presents himself as a patriot king, in contrast to the foreignness often associated with earlier Hanoverian. The monarchy seems poised to feel more national, more rooted. His reign becomes one of the longest and most consequential, stretching across war, revolution, and industrial transformation. Early on, Britain fights and wins the 7 Years' War, expanding its global reach. Yet that victory carries a price: debt, taxation, and the decision to extract more revenue from American colonies. The resulting conflict spirals into the American Revolution, and Britain loses the 13 colonies. This is not just a military defeat, it is an ideological shock, a warning that empire can break. Later, George's reign is dominated by the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Britain becomes a fortress island power, financing coalitions, maintaining naval dominance, and fighting a long struggle that shapes Europe. The era produces both patriotic mythology and deep social strain. High prices, unrest, and fear of revolution at home. Then there is George's health. Episodes of mental illness, often linked historically to madness, with modern speculation about causes, lead to periods of incapacity. The details remain debated, but the political consequence is clear. By 1811, his son becomes Prince Regent. George III's reign ends in blindness and isolation, a king living in darkness while the world changes beyond his reach. When he dies in 1820, he leaves a Britain that is powerful, industrializing, and politically restless, with a monarchy increasingly dependent on public perception rather than unquestioned authority. George V becomes king in 1820 after serving as Prince Regent for years, and his reign carries the glitter of extravagance and the sourness of scandal. He is a patron of the arts, obsessed with style, architecture, and display. Buildings like the Brighton Pavilion capture the mood, lavish, theatrical, almost dreamlike, as if the monarchy is trying to enchant people into forgetting its flaws. But George's personal life damages the crown's dignity. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick is disastrous, and the public spectacle of their conflict becomes a national obsession. Attempts to disgrace her backfire, generating sympathy and turning royal domestic misery into political theatre. It is a reminder that by the 19th century, monarchy is increasingly judged not just by power, but by morality performed in public. Politically, this is an era of pressure for reform. Industrialization changes society, cities swell, labor conditions harden, and demands for representation grow louder. The monarchy is not at the center of policy-making in the way medieval kings were, but it remains a symbol that can be blamed, mocked, or defended. George III's reign ends in 1830, leaving behind a crown that looks splendid but feels fragile in public affection. His successor, William IV, will rule briefly, and then the monarchy will enter a new phase under Victoria, one that redefines royal identity for the modern age. William IV becomes king in 1830, and his reign has a comparatively modest tone. He is sometimes described as more straightforward than his brother, less wrapped in theatrical luxury. The court's temperature cools slightly, and the monarchy feels closer to ordinary political life, though still separated by ritual and privilege. The defining political event is the Reform Act of 1832, which expands representation and reshapes the electoral system. The monarchy's role here is delicate. William's involvement, such as the possibility of creating new peers to pass reform, shows that the Crown still has constitutional leverage, but it must use it carefully. The era's lesson is that monarchy survives by adapting to pressure rather than resisting it until it breaks. William's reign also touches the question of slavery and empire. Britain abolishes slavery in most of its empire in 1833, a monumental legal shift driven by activism, moral argument, and economic factors. The end of slavery does not mean the end of exploitation, and compensation paid to slave owners rather than the enslaved leaves a bitter moral stain in the historical record. The monarchy is not the direct architect of these policies, but it sits atop the system that profited from empire. William dies in 1837 without legitimate surviving children, and the crown passes to his niece Victoria. With her, the monarchy will be reinvented as a moral symbol, a family ideal, and an imperial emblem. An image so strong, it will shape how people imagine royalty even today. Victoria becomes queen in 1837 at the age of 18, and the first impression is youth framed by immense ceremony. The monarchy by this point is constitutional in practice, but it still matters profoundly as a national symbol. What Victoria does, often quietly, is turn that symbol into something emotionally gripping. Domestic virtue, duty, and the image of a sovereign who is both elevated and relatable. Her early years include a struggle for influence, including the famous bedchamber crisis, and the push and pull between political leaders and the young queen's preferences. Over time, she learns a kind of restraint, and that restraint becomes power of a different sort. Victoria marries Prince Albert in 1840, and together they shape the monarchy into a public model of family, moral, industrious, purposeful. This is not accidental. It is branding, long before the word becomes common. The reign is vast. Britain industrializes rapidly, cities swelling with factory smoke and crowded streets. The empire expands and hardens, reaching deeper into Asia, Africa, and beyond. Victoria becomes Empress of India in 1896, a title that signals how the monarchy is used to legitimize imperial control. The crown becomes an emblem above systems of extraction and rule, beautiful in portraits, often brutal in lived reality. Victoria's personal grief becomes part of the monarchy's emotional mythology. When Albert dies in 1861, she enters long mourning and withdraws from public life, triggering criticism and Republican murmurs. Yet the monarchy survives because her mourning also creates a narrative of sincerity, devotion, and endurance. She returns gradually, and by the late reign she becomes a symbol of continuity, almost like the human embodiment of the century itself. When Victoria dies in 1901, it feels like a curtain closing on an era. The monarchy she leaves behind is not the medieval crown of command. It is a crown of meaning, an institution surviving by shaping feelings, identity, and the idea of the nation. Edward VII. Edward VII becomes king in 1901, and the mood changes immediately. Lighter, more social, more outward-facing. He has waited decades as Prince of Wales, living a life filled with parties, fashion, and scandal. As king, he brings a different energy, convivial, diplomatic, and more comfortable with modernity's public pace. His reign is short but significant. Britain is grappling with the Second Boer War's aftermath and deeper anxieties about empire, military preparedness, and social reform. Edward's court becomes a centre for high society, but beneath the glitter, the political world is shifting. The power of the House of Lords is challenged, and new social pressures are rising from labour movements and demands for welfare. Edward is sometimes called the Uncle of Europe because of his family connections with continental royalty. These relationships are real, but their diplomatic effectiveness is limited. Still, he plays a role in fostering friendlier relations with France, associated with the Entente Cordiale, part of the broader realignment that will shape Europe's path to world war. Edward's monarchy is less about stern morality and more about charm. Yet charm is not trivial. It is a political tool in an age when the monarchy needs popularity to justify its continued privilege. When Edward dies in 1910, the crown passes to George XV, a king who will face the most destabilizing storm imaginable: global war and the collapse of royal cousins across Europe. George V becomes king in 1910, and his reign is defined by crisis management on an unprecedented scale. Domestically, he faces constitutional conflict over the House of Lords, culminating in the Parliament Act of 1911, which limits the Lords' power. The monarchy's role is subtle but crucial, offering assent, continuity, and the sense that the state is not tearing itself apart. Then comes World War I in 1914. The war transforms everything: mass death, industrial slaughter, and a society stretched to breaking. George V becomes a symbolic anchor, visiting troops, projecting steadiness. But symbolism has to be carefully handled. Anti-German sentiment is intense, and the royal family's German ties become a threat to legitimacy. In 1917, the royal house changes its name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor. It is a calculated act of survival, rebranding to align with national identity during a moment of fury. That same year, the Russian Revolution leads to the execution of George's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, and his family. The collapse of monarchies across Europe sends a clear warning: crowns can fall, and fall violently. After the war, Britain faces economic hardship, labour unrest, and the growing pressure of Irish independence. The creation of the Irish Free State in 1922 marks another reshaping of the kingdom's boundaries. The monarchy remains, but the empire and union are visibly changing. George V dies in 1936, leaving behind a monarchy that has survived by adapting, renaming itself, and projecting stability. His son Edward VIII will test the institution in a different way, not through war, but through personal choice colliding with constitutional limits. Edward VIII becomes king in January 1936, and his reign is brief, dramatic, and deeply revealing. He is popular in some circles, modern, charismatic, seemingly closer to ordinary people than the stiff image of monarchy might suggest. But he becomes entangled in a crisis that exposes the monarchy's constraint: his desire to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The issue is not only social snobbery, though that plays a role. It is constitutional and religious. The monarch is supreme governor of the Church of England, which at the time does not accept remarriage after divorce under certain conditions. Government leaders fear the political and moral repercussions. The crown is not only a personal role, it is a public contract. Edward chooses abdication in December 1936 rather than give up the marriage. The moment is romanticized in some retellings as love conquering duty, but it is also a reminder that monarchy survives by limiting the monarch. The institution will sacrifice an individual king to protect the concept of the crown. Edward becomes Duke of Windsor, living much of his life outside Britain. His later associations and political attitudes, particularly allegations of sympathy toward Nazi Germany, remain controversial and continue to be debated. Even without settling every detail, the shadow is real. The monarchy avoided one crisis, but the story never entirely stops being uneasy. The crown passes to Edward's brother, George VI, a man not raised to be king, who will inherit not only the throne, but the looming catastrophe of World War II. George VI becomes king in 1936, and his reign carries the weight of reluctant duty. He is shy, conscientious, and famously struggles with a stammer, making public speech a crucial royal task in the age of radio, painful and fraught. Yet this vulnerability becomes paradoxically a source of strength in public perception. He feels human. World War II defines the reign. George VI and Queen Elizabeth remain in London during the Blitz, a symbolic choice that matters deeply. The monarchy becomes a focal point of endurance, visiting bomb sites, comforting civilians, projecting that the nation's leadership shares the danger. In an era of mass propaganda and morale, this is not cosmetic, it is central to legitimacy. The war also accelerates the decline of empire. After 1945, Britain is exhausted economically and socially. The movement toward decolonization grows stronger, and the monarchy's relationship to empire begins to shift. India becomes independent in 1947. George VI ceases to be Emperor of India, and the Commonwealth becomes a new framework for post-imperial connection, still tied to the crown in symbolic ways. George's health deteriorates in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He dies in 1952, and the crown passes to his daughter Elizabeth II, beginning a reign that will redefine modern monarchy through longevity, media exposure, and the changing moral expectations of the public. Elizabeth II becomes queen in 1952, and her reign is a long meditation on continuity in a world that keeps changing faster than tradition can easily absorb. In the early years, the monarchy still carries the aura of empire's afterglow. But the political reality is rapid decolonization, cultural transformation, and the rise of mass media. Her coronation in 1953 is broadcast, bringing royal ceremony into living rooms, turning ritual into a shared national event. This is one of the great shifts of modern monarchy. The crown becomes not only something seen from afar, but something consumed as image and story. The family becomes both institution and entertainment. The reign includes moments of national and global crisis, wars, economic turbulence, political upheaval, but the monarchy's role becomes increasingly symbolic, focused on representing stability rather than directing policy. That symbolic role is constantly tested by public scrutiny. The late 20th century becomes particularly challenging. Divorce, scandal, and tragedy shake the royal family's carefully curated image. The death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997 becomes a seismic moment, exposing public anger and grief and forcing the monarchy to adjust its emotional language. The crown learns it must be seen to feel, not only to endure. Across decades, Elizabeth becomes a figure of continuity, an anchor for those who want the nation to feel coherent. Yet continuity can also look like stubbornness, and critics question the relevance and cost of monarchy in modern life. Elizabeth II dies in 2022, ending an era. Her reign is often described through milestones and jubilees, but its deeper story is about adaptation under relentless scrutiny, how the crown survives by becoming both more visible and more carefully controlled. Charles III becomes king in 2022, and his reign begins in a world where monarchy is no longer protected by distance. Every gesture is recorded, interpreted, argued over. Charles has spent decades as Prince of Wales, known for strong opinions on architecture, environment, and social issues, traits that can be praised as thoughtful or criticised as overstepping. As king, he inherits an institution balancing tradition with a public increasingly sceptical of inherited privilege. The Commonwealth is changing too, with debates about republicanism and the crown's symbolic role in former colonies shaped by histories of exploitation and slavery. The monarchy's past is not safely buried. It is constantly resurfacing in public conversation. Charles also inherits a family story that is inseparable from modern royal identity. The legacy of Diana, the complexities of remarriage, and the fractured image of unity. The crown's task is no longer only constitutional stability, it is narrative stability, managing the story of what the monarchy is for. In the quiet view, Charles's reign is still young, and history has not finished writing its verdict. But the themes are already clear. a monarchy trying to remain meaningful without pretending it is all-powerful, and trying to remain dignified while living under the microscope of a culture that delights in pulling down symbols. The royal story does not end here. It continues forward, toward the next generation, toward uncertain public mood, toward a future where the crown may need to reinvent itself again, as it has so many times before. The royals around the throne, now as we keep moving through this gentle corridor of history, it helps to widen the lens, because every British royal is not only the monarch, it is also the spouse who steadies or destabilizes the crown, the heir who becomes a symbol before they become a ruler, the child whose marriage becomes foreign policy, the favorite who becomes a scandal, the mother who becomes the true power in the room. Monarchy is a family system with national consequences. Sometimes the most decisive person in the story never sits on the throne at all. So we'll visit some of the key figures, consorts, heirs, and influential royals, moving in the same slow chronological spirit. Not as gossip, but as structure, because every crown is held up by unseen hands, and sometimes those hands squeeze. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of the most remarkable royals in medieval Europe, Queen of France, then Queen of England, mother of kings, and a political force in her own right. When she marries Henry II, she brings vast territories and enormous prestige. She also brings a personality too large to be easily contained by medieval expectations. Eleanor's influence is felt in politics, culture, and family conflict. She supports her sons in rebellion against Henry II in the 1170s, a decision that leads to her imprisonment for years. The image is stark, a queen confined, not because she lacked power, but because she had too much. When Henry dies, Eleanor re-emerges, effectively acting as a crucial stabilizer for Richard I's reign, managing affairs while he is on crusade. She negotiates, travels, commands. She behaves less like a decorative consort and more like a regent with steel in her spine. Eleanor's story matters because it reveals the monarchy as family drama on a continental scale. Marriages are alliances, children are rivals, love is optional, power is the real relationship. In the quiet of history, Eleanor stands as proof that royalty is not always passive. Sometimes it is a woman holding the threads of kingdoms while the crowned men chase war and glory. Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, becomes a key figure during the Wars of the Roses, and her story is a reminder that queens can become commanders when circumstances demand it. Henry's weakness and mental illness leave a vacuum, and Margaret moves into it with determination. She fights not only for her husband's crown, but for her son's inheritance. In a world that treats dynasties like property, a queen can become a warrior for her child's future. Margaret's leadership makes her both feared and hated. Later, propaganda depicts her as foreign, unnatural, and cruel, classic tactics used to demonize women who step into power. Yet, contemporary reality is simpler. The throne is contested and Margaret refuses to surrender. She raises armies, negotiates alliances, and endures defeat after defeat. The wars carve England into a landscape of ambush and betrayal, and Margaret becomes one of its most relentless figures. Her eventual downfall, her son killed, her cause destroyed, has the bleakness of a tragedy with no soft ending. She is ransomed back to France, and her later life fades into quiet obscurity. Margaret matters because she shows how monarchy's survival often depends on those willing to fight when the monarch cannot. She also shows how history punishes such figures in memory, turning complex political actors into caricatures to make the victor's story cleaner. Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, is one of the most consequential consorts in British history, not because she sought revolution, but because her marriage became the hinge of one. She arrives in England with dynastic weight, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, bringing the aura of a great Catholic monarchy. For years, Catherine is respected, dutiful, and politically capable. She even serves as regent while Henry campaigns in France, and is associated with English success against Scotland at Flodden in 1513. She is not merely decorative, she is functional. The tragedy is the succession. Catherine's pregnancies do not yield a surviving son, and Henry's desire for an annulment turns her into an obstacle. But Catherine refuses to cooperate with her own erasure. She insists her marriage is valid, that she is the rightful queen, and that her daughter Mary is legitimate. Her resistance becomes a moral symbol for many. In a court that increasingly treats people as chess pieces, Catherine insists on dignity. That insistence costs her. She is separated from her daughter, stripped of status, and kept under controlled condition. Catherine's story is quiet suffering mixed with steel. She does not lead armies, she fights with legitimacy, conscience and refusal. And through her, the monarchy's private obsession becomes national upheaval, changing England's religion, politics and identity. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn enters the Tudor story like a spark near dry timber. She is intelligent, ambitious and, most dangerously, impossible to ignore. In a court where women are expected to orbit male power, Anne becomes a gravitational force. Henry VIII's obsession with her isn't only romantic, it's political. By refusing to be a mistress and demanding marriage, she helps push the king toward the break with Rome. Anne's rise is surrounded by faction. Some see her as the future, a symbol of reform and new influence. Others see her as a threat to the old order, a woman whose success means their own decline. The court becomes a place where every smile has a knife behind it. As queen, Anne's position is never secure because her value in Henry's eyes is tied to one thing, producing a male heir. She gives birth to Elizabeth in 1533, an event that will later look like destiny, but at the time feels like disappointment. Miscarriages follow, and the mood around her darken. In 1536, Anne is arrested and accused of adultery, incest and treason. The charges are widely viewed by many historians as politically engineered, and contemporary accounts suggest the process moves with suspicious speed. She is tried, convicted and executed in the Tower of London. Anne's death is not only personal tragedy, it is a lesson. In Tudor monarchy, intimacy is policy, and policy can kill. The crown can lift you to the highest place in the realm, and then erase you when you become inconvenient. Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour arrives into the story as the opposite of Anne. Quiet, compliant, carefully presented as gentle virtue. That contrast is not accidental. Henry VIII, after Anne's fall, seems to crave a queen who will not challenge him, someone who will reflect his authority rather than compete with it. Jane becomes queen in 1536, and her most defining act is one she does not fully control. She gives Henry the son he has demanded. Edward is born in 1537, and the court erupts in celebration, relief, and the kind of triumphant gratitude that can feel almost frightening, because it reveals how completely a woman's worth has been reduced to dynastic function. Jane dies soon after childbirth, likely from complications that medicine at the time cannot treat. Her death freezes her in an idealized form. She becomes, in Henry's memory, the good queen, the one who delivered the heir and then vanished before she could become a problem. There is a particular cruelty in how the story can be told. Jane's success is defined by a child and sealed by her death. She is praised because she does not live long enough to disappoint. And yet, in that brief moment, Jane changes everything. Edward's birth stabilizes the Tudor line, temporarily, and sets the stage for the violent religious swings to come. The heir exists, but the kingdom will discover that having an heir is not the same as having peace. Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves becomes Henry VIII's fourth wife in 1540, and her story has the strange tone of a political mismatch that turns into a narrow escape. The marriage is arranged for diplomatic reasons, intended to strengthen Protestant alliances in Europe. It is monarchy as foreign policy, with a woman used as the seal on an international letter. Henry meets Anne and claims disappointment. Later narratives emphasize his lack of attraction, though the truth is tangled in propaganda and wounded ego. What matters is the speed with which the marriage collapses. Anne is blamed for not matching Henry's fantasy, as if the failure is hers rather than his. The annulment is arranged quickly, and Anne, astonishingly for a Tudor queen, survives and even prospers. She accepts her new status as the king's sister, receives property, and remains in England. Her survival suggests something rare, a royal figure who navigates danger through consent and pragmatism rather than confrontation. Anne's story matters because it reveals a hidden skill in royal life, knowing when to yield, not because yielding is morally superior, but because in a court where the king's disappointment can become a death sentence, survival is its own victory. In the soft light of history, Anne of Cleves feels like a woman who steps aside just in time, leaving the room before the fire reaches her dress. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard becomes Henry VIII's fifth wife in 1540, and her story is one of youth swallowed by a system that does not care if it ruins you. She is a teenager, exact age uncertain but unquestionably young, thrown into the role of queen beside an aging king whose affection is hungry, possessive, and deeply conditional. Catherine's background is shaped by a lack of protection. Her early life includes relationships and experiences that, in a modern lens, look like exploitation. Yet Tudor morality and law do not offer nuance. The court does not treat her as a vulnerable young woman. It treats her as either pure or criminal. Accusations emerge of past sexual activity and later alleged adultery while queen. The details are complex, and the power imbalance around her is impossible to ignore. But the political machine moves quickly once suspicion becomes useful. Catherine is arrested and executed in 1542. Her death has a different flavour than Anne Boleyn's. Anne's fall is entangled with religious revolution and factional warfare. Catherine's feels like a brutal disposal of a girl who never had a chance to understand the rules of the game she was forced to play. In the hush afterward, the Tudor court looks colder. The crown's splendour is still there, glittering, but now it's easier to see what it's made of. Appetite, fear, and a willingness to crush the young for the comfort of the powerful. Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr becomes Henry VIII's sixth wife in 1543, and her story is often about survival through intelligence. She is older than Henry's previous queens, experienced and capable of navigating a court where one careless sentence can be fatal. Catherine's role is partly domestic. She helps stabilise the royal household, and she forms relationships with Henry's children, including the future Elizabeth the Finn. But she is also intellectually engaged, drawn toward Protestant reform, and willing to discuss theology in a way that is dangerous for a queen. At one point, Catherine's religious views put her at real risk. There are accounts suggesting warrants were prepared for her arrest. Whether every detail is exactly as later stories tell it, the underlying truth is credible. Henry's court remains lethal, and Catherine's ideas could have made her the next target. She survives by tact, by presenting herself as obedient, framing religious discussion as a way to entertain and soothe the king rather than challenge him. It is a performance of humility that protects her life. After Henry's death in 1547, Catherine marries Thomas Seymour and dies in 1548 after childbirth. Her brief post-royal life shows how little protection even a former queen truly has once the king is gone. Catherine Parr matters because she embodies a quieter royal power, influence through learning, steadiness, and careful speech. In a dynasty obsessed with heirs and execution blocks, she represents something rarer, someone who lives. Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, is one of the great architects of the Tudor rise, and her story shows how monarchy can be built by someone who never wears the crown. Married young, widowed, and politically shrewd, she spends decades navigating the shifting dangers of the Wars of the Roses with an eye fixed on one goal, her son's claim. She networks, negotiates, and aligns herself with power when necessary, surviving reigns that could have destroyed her. Her influence helped secure Henry Tudor's invasion and victory in 1485, and afterward she remains a powerful presence at court, almost a second queen in status if not in title. Margaret's piety is famous, but it coexists with political calculation. She sponsors education and religious foundations, shaping cultural legacy, while also ensuring Tudor authority is reinforced. She understands image. The monarchy needs not only force, but moral narrative. Her story matters because it reveals a truth often hidden in royal histories. Dynasties are frequently made by mothers, widows, and women working through alliances and patronage rather than armies. Margaret does not win battles in armour. She wins by surviving long enough to make the crown change hand. In the soft echo of Tudor corridors, Margaret Beaufort feels like the quietest kind of power, persistent, patient, and ultimately victorious. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, is not a British monarch in the English line, but she becomes one of the most dangerous British royals in the shared island story because her blood, her religion, and her charisma make her a living alternative crown. She is Queen of Scotland as an infant, raised partly in France and married into French royalty. Her early life feels like velvet and ceremony, then it turns into disaster. Widowed young, she returns to Scotland in 1561, a Catholic queen in a land that has shifted toward Protestant power. Her reign becomes a tangle of faction, religious tension, and personal choices that become political catastrophes. Marriages, murders, scandal, each event tightening the net around her legitimacy. In 1568, Mary flees to England seeking protection from Elizabeth the Fee. Instead, she becomes a prisoner. For nearly 2 decades, she is held under controlled conditions because Elizabeth cannot safely free her and cannot easily justify killing her until plots and fear make the decision seem inevitable. Mary is executed in 1587. Her death is a grim lesson in royal logic. Sometimes the safest rival is a dead one. But her execution also stains Elizabeth's reign, and it transforms Mary into a martyr figure for Catholic cause. Mary's legacy is complicated by one final twist. Her son, James VI of Scotland, becomes James I of England in 1603. The woman the English state treated as a threat becomes the mother of the dynasty that inherits the English throne. In the quiet, Mary feels like the embodiment of dynastic inevitability. You can imprison a royal body. You cannot always imprison royal bloodlines. Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, is one of the most influential consorts in British history, precisely because he makes the monarchy look modern and purposeful. He arrives as a German prince, initially mistrusted by some, and must build his position carefully. A consort has no crown of their own, only proximity to one, and proximity can be resented. Albert becomes Victoria's partner in governance and public image. He champions reform, education, industry, and the idea that monarchy should be moral and industrious rather than merely glamorous. The Great Exhibition of 1851 becomes one of his signature achievements, an enormous celebration of innovation and empire, presented as progress made visible. Albert's influence helps craft the Victorian ideal of royal family life, domestic virtue elevated into national symbolism. This is not merely personal preference, it is strategic. In a century of political reform and rising public scrutiny, the monarchy survives by appearing respectable, stable, and useful. When Albert dies in 1861, Victoria's grief becomes legendary, and the monarchy's image shifts again toward mourning, duty, and endurance. Albert's absence is not just emotional, it changes the machinery of the royal household and the Queen's relationship to public life. Albert matters because he shows the hidden power of a consort, shaping the crown's identity from inside the palace. He does not command armies, he commands image, institution, and the future tone of monarchy itself. Alexandra of Denmark becomes Princess of Wales in 1863, when she marries the future Edward VII, and later she becomes Queen Consort in 1901. Her life unfolds in a monarchy that is increasingly public, photographed, and discussed. Beauty, style, and demeanour become political in a new way, because the royal family is becoming a kind of national mirror. Alexandra is widely admired for her appearance and charm. and she understands the power of presentation. In a world where monarchy must be liked to survive, likability becomes currency. Yet beneath the elegance is a quieter resilience. Alexandra endures personal strain in her marriage, including Edward's affairs, which are widely known. Royal marriage, once sealed largely for dynasty, is now expected to feel moral, and that expectation creates a new kind of pressure. She is also shaped by health difficulties, including hearing loss, which she manages while continuing public roles. That management itself becomes part of her royal skill, to maintain grace while hiding discomfort, to appear effortless while working hard to remain composed. Alexandra's era is one of imperial confidence and simmering anxiety. She becomes queen at the dawn of the 20th century, when Britain still sees itself as dominant, yet the cracks, political, social, and international, are widening. Her role, like many consorts, is not policy but symbolism, steadying the crown's image, smoothing its edges, making it feel human. When she is widowed in 1910, she becomes Queen Mother in effect, a figure of continuity as the world slides toward war. Alexandra matters because she embodies the shift toward modern monarchy, not ruler but icon, expected to sparkle, endure, and soften the institution's harder truths. Queen Mary of Teck. Mary of Teck, wife of George V, becomes Queen Consort in 1910 and is one of the most institutionally significant royals of the 20th century. She is not just a figurehead, she is a guardian of monarchy's continuity, deeply committed to tradition, ceremony, and the careful curation of royal image. Mary's early life carries a strange twist. She was originally engaged to George V's older brother, Prince Albert Victor, who died suddenly. She then marries George, stepping into a role that feels almost fated. In the royal world, personal feeling often comes second to dynastic necessity. As Queen, Mary becomes a stabilizing presence through immense upheaval. World War I, the rebranding to Windsor, and the shifting relationship between monarchy and modern public opinion. She understands the value of symbolism with a kind of instinctive seriousness. Ritual matters, not because it is pretty, but because it persuades people that the institution is permanent. Her personal character is often described as reserved, disciplined, and sometimes emotionally distant, traits that can be criticized, but that also reflect the era's expectation of royal self-control. Mary's duty is to represent endurance, and she does it with relentless consistency. She becomes Queen Mother after George V's death and lives into the reign of her granddaughter, Elizabeth II. By then, she feels like the last great figure of old-style monarchy, an embodiment of the crown's stiff spine. Mary matters because she shows how monarchy survives crisis, by clinging to ceremony like a life raft. When the world changes too quickly, tradition becomes the crown's way of insisting, "We are still here." Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson is not born royal, but she becomes one of the most disruptive figures in modern British monarchy because her relationship with Edward VIII triggers abdication. In a sense, she is the human wedge that splits the old assumption that a king can do whatever he pleases. Wallis is American, divorced and socially polarizing. To many in Britain's establishment, she represents not just a personal scandal, but a constitutional threat, because Edward's insistence on marrying her forces the monarchy to confront its own limits. The crown is not merely a man's private life, it is a national institution entangled with church and state. The abdication crisis exposes the monarchy's dependence on political consent. Ministers, parliament, and the press shape what is possible. Edward cannot simply decree his way through. When he abdicates, Wallis becomes a symbol, villain to some, modern woman to others, scapegoat in many stories. Her later life with the Duke of Windsor is wrapped in controversy, partly because of their social circles and wartime associations. Even without treating every rumour as fact, the underlying point stands. This episode shakes public trust and forces the monarchy to redefine duty as non-negotiable. Wallis matters because she reveals that modern royalty is governed by public morality and constitutional restriction as much as by bloodline. In earlier centuries, kings kept mistresses openly and survived. In the 20th century, love can bring down a king because the institution is now fragile in a different way, held up by perception. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon becomes Queen Consort in 1936, when her husband becomes George VI, and her public role during World War II makes her one of the most beloved figures in modern royal memory. Like her husband, she is not supposed to be on the throne. Abdication pushes them into it. That unwillingness becomes part of the appeal. They look like duty accepted, not power grabbed. During the Blitz, she remains in London and visits bombed areas, projecting courage and solidarity. Her presence becomes a symbol of national resilience, a performance that is also sincere in its intent. The monarchy, in wartime, must feel like it shares the risk, and she helps make that believable. After the war, she becomes Queen Mother when Elizabeth II takes the throne. Her public persona is warmth, charm, and tradition, an older style of monarchy that many find comforting. She becomes a living bridge between eras, the empire's decline, the rise of television culture, the transformation of public attitudes. Yet her image is also part of a larger royal strategy, maintaining affection. In a constitutional monarchy, affection is a form of power. It protects the institution from political attack. The Queen Mother embodies that protection for decades, appearing at events, smiling through change, representing continuity like a familiar song. She lives to 2002, reaching the age of 101, and by the end she is almost mythic in public imagination, a royal who seems to have outlasted the century's turbulence through sheer, steady presence. Diana, Princess of Wales. Diana becomes Princess of Wales in 1981 when she marries Prince Charles, and her story transforms the monarchy's relationship with the public. She arrives as a young woman in a global media age where cameras do not simply record royalty, they consume it. Her wedding becomes a spectacle watched by millions, a fairy tale broadcast in real time. But the fairy tale decays quickly. Diana struggles with the pressures of royal life, with mental health challenges, and with the loneliness of being both adored and trapped. Her marriage deteriorates amid mutual unhappiness and public scrutiny. The monarchy, built on controlled image, finds itself confronted by a figure who generates emotion more powerfully than the institution can manage. Diana's public work, particularly around HIV/AIDS patients and landmine campaigns, helps reshape the meaning of royal charity. She uses touch, presence, and visible empathy in ways that feel modern and intimate. She becomes an icon, not just of glamour, but of vulnerability. When Diana dies in a car crash in 1997, the public reaction is overwhelming. Grief turns into anger. The monarchy's initial restraint is interpreted as coldness, and the institution is forced to adapt quickly, to speak emotionally, to appear human in a new way. The episode becomes a lesson in the age of mass feeling. Symbolism must now include visible empathy. Diana matters because she changes the emotional expectations of monarchy. After her, the crown cannot simply stand above. It must respond, explain, and sometimes even apologize, because public perception has become the throne's invisible foundation, the heirs and the shape of the future. And now the corridor stretches forward into a living story. Heirs are raised in public, trained to represent continuity before they fully understand what that continuity costs. The modern monarchy is still built on family, but the family is watched like a drama, judged like a government, and criticized like a corporation. The Prince of Wales becomes not just a person, but a projection screen for national hopes, resentments, and fascination. Children become symbols before they become adults. Marriage becomes public property. Mistakes become headlines. This is the final transformation of British royalty, the crown as media presence. The power of the monarchy is no longer in laws and armies. It is in narrative, ritual, and the strange human desire for a living emblem. The royals survive by turning themselves into familiar figures, while also insisting they remain special. It is an impossible balance, which is why modern royal life looks so tense. The institution needs intimacy to be loved, but distance to be respected. It needs tradition to feel meaningful, but reform to feel tolerable. And speaking softly, in the spirit of falling asleep, you can let that contradiction settle like a blanket. The monarchy has always been a contradiction, sacred and political, family and state, symbol and machine. So as the last candles gutter in our long corridor of crowns, it's worth noticing what stays the same, even when everything else changes. The names shift, Alfred, William, Elizabeth, George, Charles, but the underlying rhythm repeats. A kingdom wants stability, and the crown promises it. The crown wants obedience, and the people bargain for protection. Sometimes the bargain is honoured, sometimes it's broken so violently that the whole room shakes. You've heard monarchs who ruled with swords, and monarchs who ruled with documents, kings who conquered and kings who were removed, queens who survived by charm, and queens who were discarded when they became inconvenient. You've heard the crown used as a weapon in religious war, as a banner in empire, as a symbol in world conflict, and finally as a story told through cameras and headlines. And still the crown remains, less absolute than it once was, but strangely persistent. Maybe that's the most British part of it all. Not the glory, not the pageantry, the persistence, the ability of an institution to shed skin, change language, rename itself, soften its edges and carry on, while the world around it transforms. If you're still awake, let the centuries blur together. Let the battles fade into distant thunder. Let the scandals become muffled whispers behind heavy doors. The corridor is quiet now. The portraits don't move. The crowns sit in glass. And somewhere beneath all the gold and velvet, the real story hums on, steady as a heartbeat, slow as a lullaby, waiting for the next name, the next reign, the next turn of the wheel.